I have gotten my documentary students, they've watched 3 of your projects, and I had them ask some questions, pose some questions for you that I'm just gonna ask you and have you answer.
Sure.
All right. So first things first, maybe let's start about what it's like to make the stories that you make before this outbreak. And then we can talk about how you've had to learn how to work under the confines of this pandemic.
Totally, yeah. So before I work at the New York Times, and before the pandemic, a lot of stories, before we even start working on them, we have a lot of meetings about them. We brainstorm, we're collaborating from start to finish. It's a lot of in-person conversations, talking through characters and story, and is this going to be a video? Is it going to be an interactive? Like, what is our goal here? And then each story is different. Like, from there, we usually try to go meet people. We do phone calls. A lot of things happen in person. I think is probably the biggest difference between then and now, is that before everything was in person, from meetings to, meeting with your coworkers to meeting with the people in your films. Whereas now everything is electronic and digital. And so it just has totally, in a lot of ways, it's just changed every part of the process, from pre-production to production to post-production.
One of the students asked about what it's like to make videos for a newspaper that's not traditionally a video, or like it's not traditional, it's not a news station.
Mm-hmm.
You've had a lot of experience with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's what informs my opinion on this is that I went to school at UNC, where I learned how to make videos, not a part of a newspaper, just making videos for the sake of making videos. And then I interned at the LA Times and the Washington Post, both newspapers. Then I worked at Mashable, which is a digital website, like a digital production company. So no newspaper component. Then I worked at the New Yorker, which was a magazine. And now I'm at the Times, which is a newspaper. So I think I've worked in a variety of spaces that view video very differently. There's pros and cons. Like, the con is that the New York Times is a newspaper, and that's not a con in and of itself, but in terms of video, it's never going to be the number one priority. The pro is that because it's not the priority, sometimes there's not these very specific standards of how we execute video. Whereas if you're at a news station that has a nightly news program that runs every day, it has done that for 50 plus years, there's a way to do something. So at the Times, or at newspapers in general, I have found that they're very open to creativity, and open to new forms of how we do things and how we deliver stories and experiences. So, and at the Times in particular, there's so many resources and there is so much support, even though it's not a video focused operation. We still have the support we need to make good things, and there's a lot of flexibility in how we make them, which is probably the coolest part.
That's a really good distinction, I think, that it doesn't have to be a 1 minute and 30-second news package.
Exactly. And so I have found, even in when I look at the work I did last year, the variety of work I did, both in subject matter and how we executed it, how it looks, how we shot it. Do we have people on camera, or reporters on camera, or are we using voiceover? Are we doing things internationally on cell phones? There's such a variety, whereas if you're at a place that has a very rigid format, it's much harder to do that kind of thing.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of my students have questions about how you find your subjects. So can you talk a little bit about that, like how you find subjects, but also you work on your own, you also work on teams. What's that experience like, of kind of talk through the beginning of an idea of a story and then how you get to the end of it?
Yeah, so this is not something that I am particularly good at. At the Times, I'm on the cinematography unit, so many of the stories, I would say probably 95 to 100% of the things I work on come to me, and then I'm tasked with thinking of them visually, or identifying, there's 10 people we might follow. I'm this is the person we should follow. And really, since COVID has happened, I've had to become more entrepreneurial in finding characters and finding my own stories, because the way we tell stories has drastically changed. So if I want to be in the field, it's not only my responsibility, but I definitely have a larger role in finding stories and characters myself. So with that said, I start with subject matter or themes. So like two of the things I've been looking into are like grieving. So from grieving, I look into funeral homes, and from funeral homes, I just start calling directors all day to see like who is open to access. So far, none of them have been, so that will happen too. But that's one way to do it. The other way is to think about, different neighborhoods in New York is a way for me to get my head around like this huge story. It's like, what if I just focused on, a certain neighborhood? And then within that neighborhood, I look at what is the hospital in that neighborhood? What are the funeral homes in that neighborhood? What are the nursing homes in that neighborhood? Just think of that as its own little city, which I have to do being in New York, where I'm totally overwhelmed by the scope of it. So that's how I've been kind of looking at it, is like, how can I narrow it down first? And then like within those parameters, start making as many calls as possible, because I can't meet someone in person, I can't be like, ooh, that person's a good character. Or like, well, I'm just going to go out for the day and walk around. So right now it's looked like a ton of calls and just trying to like screen characters over the phone.
Usually when someone comes to you with an idea and they have 10 characters, how do you make that decision about the person to follow? Like, this is the person I think who's going to lead this story.
Yeah, I think like number one is charisma, like someone who can speak really well. And I don't mean that in terms of like, is like a public speaker, but someone who can articulate their feelings or their emotions or their experience in a way that feels like really natural and authentic and not forced or like caged. So that's like number one, the most important for sure. And then two, it's like, is their story happening right now, or did it happen in the past? Like, so many good characters, their stuff has already happened. So they might be able to reflect poetically on it, but in terms of like, what am I going to film with you? So that's kind of like number 2/3 is like, what am I going to film? What do you have going on in your life, whether it's in my timeline or in the next 6 months or in the next 6 days? What am I going to film with you? Is that stuff visual? And most importantly, like, are you going to be able to speak to what you're doing in a way that's compelling? Even if you have like amazing access, amazing scenes, if the person can't speak to what they're doing or reflect or be open and honest, it usually doesn't matter. So those are I think the most important things that I usually look for. And then also, frankly, diversity. Like that was a big part of the hand clapping piece that I think y'all looked at. There's so many immigrant communities in New York, and we wanted to make sure that, we couldn't cover all of them. So we had to think strategically about, what are the ones that we can pick that feel like they cover like a substantial like amount of area without trying to like be comprehensive, because that's not something we were attempting to do or could do. So some of the things there are like, also like, we want diversity, with our subject matter, with experiences, with where people live, what kind of job they have. So those are always things that we're thinking about.
That's amazing. Thank you. Usually how long do you spend with people on these projects? So like, yeah, usually how long does it take to interview them, or how many days do you spend with them, things like that?
Yeah, so it totally varies. Like the hand clapping project, we probably spent an hour with each of those groups filming, so not long. The reporter who wrote the story spent more time with them over the phone, but in terms of being in person, that was like, we had a very particular way we were going to shoot it. It wasn't going to take that long, so we could kind of be in and out pretty quickly. With other things, what else? You guys watched the Chicano culture piece. That piece I learned I was doing probably like 3 days before we left. So like very quickly, things had to like get in motion. And then we were in Japan, I think, for 8 days, and then flew back. So those were like 8 full shoot days. We were with the people nonstop. But even like in that piece, Junichi, he's the guy who owns the car shop. We probably spent 3 hours with him. We had like an hour-long interview. We shot with him around the shop for like an hour and a half or so. And we knew he was going to have to be a substantial part of the piece. So you're shooting that as like, we're going to shoot the interview. That's going to be one thing. We're going to shoot B-roll of the shop. That's going to be another thing. We're going to shoot the video portrait. That's going to be another thing. And then we're going to shoot like a tour of the shop, which will be like an active scene with him. So there's like a lot of things we had to think about. We aren't just getting one moment with that guy, Junichi, for the piece. We need him to like, we need to get B-roll, and we need to get stuff that he's talking about that's going to link together all the other parts of the piece. So it's usually not that long that we spend with people. We definitely aren't doing like long form documentaries on one character over a year or 5 years or 10 years. So a lot of times we have to think really strategically about how we can get things done in like a day with a person, or less.
Wow. It takes a lot of producing.
It's a lot of, yeah, it's a lot of producing and a lot of like just thinking in advance about what you know you need, what you could maybe need in the edit. And like, those are basically the two big things. And that comes with time. I mean, everyone makes the same mistakes twice. I think like that like phrase of like, you don't make the same mistake twice. It's just like totally not accurate. But I probably don't make it 5 times. I probably make it like between like 2 and 4 times. And then I realize, oh yes, I need the exterior shot of the building every time. Oh yeah, like if they're doing like if they're making ice cream, shooting a bit of slow motion, not all slow motion, but shooting some is going to be helpful for like if you want more of like a dreamscape. You kind of learn the things that you always shoot that you never need, and the things that you never shoot and you always need. And that comes with experience, and like there's kind of no way to short circuit it.
Um, that's so good. I think having that shooting list is a really important one because you really do.
Yeah,
You get back to your edit and you've totally forgotten things that you really need.
totally.
Um, okay, so I had a lot of questions about gear. Like what's
Yeah.
the like usually what does your gear pack look like? Also, what's the one piece of gear you think everyone should learn how to use? And then the Chicano piece was shot on an iPhone. So can you talk a little bit about that rig? And one of my students asked if that was the future.
Yeah, I don't think it's the future. It was much more difficult to shoot that piece on iPhones than it would have been to shoot on my C300 or C500 or FS7. It was very hard. We hacked the iPhone basically to perform like one of those like top grade cinema cameras. And I'll actually send Evie pictures of that package and those rigs so you guys can see it. But it's an iPhone on a stabilizer, loaded up with a battery pack attached because it would run out of battery really quickly. Lenses that were adjustable that screwed on, ND filters on top of those lenses, and then we had an audio guy with us. So I think like one, we had an extra person in our crew that we usually don't have, which is someone just doing audio, which is not how I'm used to working. It also just made it more complicated, but necessary because iPhones do not capture good audio. So you have to have that person with you. And then also when you front load the iPhone with all those accessories, like a lens, an ND filter, a battery pack, the gimbal, like the handheld gimbal stabilizer doesn't work correctly. So like I was taping Japanese coins to one side to like counterweight it. I mean, it's absurd the amount of production that went into that. And then we're using an app called Filmic Pro, which is available to anyone. I think you pay like $15 for an extra cinematographer's toolkit. And that allows you to shoot in log, which is a color profile. It allows you to control the shutter speed, the white balance, the ISO, and all the features you're used to controlling on a camera. It allows you to do that within the iPhone. We had problems. There were days where we were recording and then the app would just delete all our footage. So we had like serious problems shooting on the iPhone. I do not recommend it. I think that it's a great way that like democratizes filmmaking and experiences, and people use that in a number of creative ways, on the internet. So I like love when people record their own experiences, but in terms of like a primary vehicle for filmmaking, I don't see that as being the future unless we're in a situation where you have to use it.
What's the number one piece of gear that you think that you're like, everyone, this really is a thing that changed my filmmaking?
I think it depends on what you want to do. Like if you want to be like a cinematographer or a video person in the media industry, I would say like learn how to use a C300 or C100. Those are great cameras that are a higher level than a DSLR, which is probably what you guys are using, like a Canon stills camera that shoots video. So the next level is a C100, C500. Those are amazing cameras that just are going to elevate your work. You'll be shocked to see like if you shoot the exact same way on that camera that you did on a, DSLR camera, your footage is just going to look better. So that's probably the number one piece of equipment. But honestly, if you aren't looking to go into this as like a career choice, then, just learning how to be really proficient on the DSLR camera is totally fine too. Those cameras can be really great. They're less forgiving with like if you mess up exposure or if you aren't using light correctly. So you just have to be more technically like adapted to that camera. But yeah, I would say like shooting with a C100 or C300 is your best bet. And if that's not available to you, or if you aren't interested in this as a career, just practicing more on like a Mark III or Mark IV or a Sony camera, a small one.
That sounds awesome. All right. What is one of your general like roadblocks during production? Like, do you have, I don't know, is there like a roadblock for editing or like a roadblock for producing a piece? I wonder if that comes from working on teams or, and then another question was, what is the first thing you do when you edit? Like you come back from a shoot, you have all your stuff. Like what's the first thing you do to figure out how to put it all together?
Yeah. Okay. So hold on. The first one's the roadblock question.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So, do you mean like in terms of like my own like creative roadblock or like to get a story out the door?
I think it could be either. They weren't specific enough.
Okay. The roadblock. What my biggest roadblock?
Um,
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
I think I think they're basically talking about editing. So I think that maybe we can just hop into the editing question of like what after you collect all the things that you think you need, that you've got, when you sit down to edit, what's the first thing you do? Like what's the first thing you do? And then yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. My roadblock and the first thing I do is that I just don't start. Like yesterday, I have all these cards I need to dump from footage, and it's 1:30 in the afternoon, and I haven't started doing it yet because I'm like terrified that it's all going to be corrupt and it's going to be horrible, and I just like can't look at it. So I think my biggest roadblock is just starting. And then I like the hardest part is always the first draft. It always is. Like it's fun to pull selects. It's fun to like see if your footage looks pretty. But in terms of like putting together an initial storyline, it's so hard. And I think that it's I like try to sometimes work around that by adding music or trying to like get myself inspired and not like being like, this is horrible, because I feel that way every time. I'm never like, I nailed it. And then I think another roadblock would be, I feel like, part of working on teams and being at a big organization is that you're going to get feedback at all stages of the process. It's definitely not something that's like just reserved till the end. And I think being able to take feedback in the early phases while still being able to like maintain your vision for it, even if other people can't see it, I think that's like the hardest thing, and it always will be. Because people can't see most of the time what you see, and I'm still learning that. It's like, how do you not see this? How do you not see that this is going to be like this in the end? And people aren't giving their feedback around what you see. They're giving feedback around what they see. And so learning how to like understand people's feedback, even if it's not word for word, while still maintaining your own vision, is like the hardest part of editing for sure.
Yeah, because then you have so many people's voices trying to figure it out.
Yeah, especially if people are giving feedback before you feel like your vision is on the timeline or like on in an export. And often I have to show people things before it's in a place where I even feel comfortable showing it. And then I get feedback that I knew I was going to get, and that I wouldn't appreciate, because I'm like, oh, I'm not there yet. I haven't even thought about the ending yet. Like, I don't really want suggestions on the ending yet. And so just learning how to honestly be like a better team player in that way.
Do you usually work with transcripts?
Yes. Yeah, we transcribe everything. Unless it's something that's like really short, really quick turnaround. We're talking like less than a day. And like we're shooting so specifically, we're interviewing very specifically to know once we got it, we're done. But in terms of if you're doing like an hour or 2 hour long interview, absolutely, definitely transcribing. If not only just like, you're like in the editing, you're like, oh, didn't they mention like, I don't know, didn't they mention the outpatient clinic at one point? And I can like Command F, outpatient clinic. And I'm like, oh yes, they did that at 32 minutes. And just like, even if it feels like it slows down the process in the beginning, it always saves you time at the end. It's also a good thing that I found with editors, like our senior editors. If they're like, did they talk about this during the interview? And I'm like, I don't think so. And then they're like, well, can you check? Either I'm gonna have to re-listen to a whole interview, or I can just like quickly search for it and be like, see, it's not in the document. So it definitely saved me a lot of time.
That's great. All right. I'm curious about with the hand clapping piece. It's not the traditional way you usually use video. So can you talk about that, about how sometimes you're pulled into projects or you work on projects that aren't just a standalone video? So how do you think people can use video for the internet in that way? Or what are those conversations and projects like that look like?
Yeah, I think you can use video for anything on the internet. I think that's becoming increasingly clear with like all of the social media apps. I feel like even with like meme culture, I mean, video can be used for anything. It can be used for like things that are hilarious, things that are excruciatingly sad, for things that are introspective. I mean, video is just like monopolized like storytelling in so many ways. Um, and so I would encourage y'all, there's a piece called Snowfall that the New York Times did that I think it was in 2008, so 12 years ago. And it was groundbreaking. For no one had done an interactive like this before that like responded to scroll and that integrated photos and video and text and data in a way that no one had ever seen before. And I remember when that happened, we thought we were we were in high school, but we studied that piece in college and still were like, what? Oh my God. And now we do that stuff by template. Like we do that kind of stuff all the time. So we're like trying to push into spaces like AR, not just interactives, social media. How do we think about things in that way? So I kind of forget what the initial question was. But in terms of like this piece the hand clapping piece got brought to me as an interactive. It was for the culture desk. They weren't going to do like a video, like a standalone click play video. They were like, we want to do this piece about hand clapping. Here's our idea. What do you think? And I'm like, yeah, no one wants to like click play and watch a video of kids hand clapping for like 3 minutes. That doesn't really totally make sense. But if it comes in line as you're like reading about the community, you're like reading about the songs they do, and then you just hear a snippet of it. I don't need a whole scene around it. I just like want to see them actually doing it. It makes sense. So it's kind of like a lot of the platforms we have, whether it be Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, Snapchat, or like interactives, all those things just like allow us to use video in like a bigger way. If they had come and been like, we want to do a standalone video on hand clapping, we would have said no. But because they're like, we want to use video in this way, it allowed us to use video like in a different way than what we would usually use it in. So yeah, I would just say like all the options on the internet have just made, usually it's not like this doesn't make sense for video. It's like, this doesn't make sense for video in this way. Let's think about other ways it would make sense.
That's really neat. I think it's neat to know that you're not just making standalones, that using the internet for this immersive experience, I think is really exciting.
And it's fun too. I think like for that project, I wanted to learn how to use an easy rig, which is like the backpack with the big like handle over the back, and I wanted to learn how to use a new piece of equipment. And I was like, oh, I'm not gonna have to like walk with the character out of their house onto the subway and like worry about knocking people over with this like giant rig. So I was like, well, this is a good opportunity for me how to learn to use that. So there's so many like pluses with that too. I could play with different lenses. I could play with color. I could play with like the actual equipment I'm using and use different things I usually wouldn't use on my day to day. So there's so many benefits to thinking about video in that way and just being open-minded to like, what is the best way that video is going to serve a story?
I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. So a few questions about the pandemic and the outbreak. So what kind of guidelines have you gotten from the New York Times about how you're supposed to work now? How have things changed like you're home. So can you talk a little bit about kind of the precautions the New York Times is taking, especially for their cinematographers?
Yeah, so we used to be able to like kind of shoot willy-nilly, like whatever we want. Um, or at least, you know, if we even thought like a story might be viable, we'd be like, oh, just go shoot for a day. Or like, you know, if it felt like low-hanging fruit, it was very easy for us to go do that, make an argument for it. And now every time I step out of my house, it is approved by the highest level of managers and security people at the Times. And that is such a benefit of being at the Times. Um, so many people do not have access to that level of security right now, but it is certainly needed. Like when I shot at a testing facility yesterday, and I am going with my own N95 mask. I'm wearing a face shield. I'm wearing gloves. I'm wearing a gown. I'm switching throughout the day. These are all things that are provided to me, and I can't go into the field unless I have them. And it's not just to protect me, it's to protect other people around. If I'm asymptomatic and I have it, who knows? We don't think so, but like, you know, things are changing every day. And so the biggest change has really been that there has to be a really good reason for us to shoot something. Um, or we just ask the people that, like, we had a piece go up about the Hasidic Jewish population yesterday, and the characters in that piece shot most of the footage, with the exception of like scenic, you know, B-roll kind of stuff. And so we're leaning a lot on the people we're, you know, working with and the people that we're featuring to film their own experiences, which is where an iPhone comes into like the whole picture. But yeah, we're shooting less, and everything we're doing just feels much higher stakes. And you have to nail it when you do it, because we don't get out of the house as much anymore.
Wow. Can you talk about the edit of the Rikers piece a little bit? That just like that process, how that was brought to you. What is it like to come in on a project? Usually you produce it,
Yeah,
you
sure.
shoot it, you edit it, right? So this
Yeah,
was you came in on the editing side of it. Can you talk a little bit about that
yeah.
experience?
So my kind of job is like 60% shooting, 40-ish% editing. Usually I end up editing my own work, or at the very least, they're projects that I'm involved with from the very beginning and known to be the editor. um, this project was different. This was a project that was started by two of my colleagues, one of whom got sick, excuse me, her boyfriend got sick with like presumed COVID. So she had to quarantine. So a different producer on our team then stepped in to fill her place in the field. And then that person who did quarantine really got sick. So she had to stop editing. So then I got brought in. So we had two new people come into the project halfway through and then 2/3 of the way through. So I was brought in to edit that piece 3 days before publish, and it needed a lot of work. It was at a really, really good like 13 minutes of like content on the timeline, but things needed to be like reshifted and cut down. Characters got taken out altogether. There was a ton to do. So that project was crazy. You know, in a matter of like 4 days, I worked 53 hours of overtime. So that's like on top of a normal day. um, so, I mean, I'm sure that's something that you guys can relate to as students. Like, editing is not fast. It never will be fast. It's always going to be like laborious and mean that you're going to pull all-nighters even when you're working full time. Um, and so it's hard to come into a project when you weren't involved in the beginning phases. And so you quickly have to orient yourself with like, what is their vision for the piece? Is that vision feasible? What is my vision for the piece? Um, and thankfully I work with really, really talented people who like their vision was feasible and then became my vision. So there certainly are things that I did in the edit that they weren't maybe going to do, just because it's my style or like how I approach things in general. But being an editor late in the process is like a much more, there's much more of a balancing act there, because I don't want to come in and just like run over what they thought the piece was going to be and be like, move aside, this is my piece now. So it's a really collaborative effort of trying to understand, what do y'all want to accomplish? Did you accomplish it? And then what are we actually going to make? And the benefit of having an editor come in who has really no history with the project is that I can look at something without being like, it took us 4 hours for that interview. Or like, we waited in our car for 6 hours until the rain stopped for that shot. I can still look at that shot and be like, it's not good. Like, I don't really care about the backstory. Or like, that interview, the audio's messed up. I'm sorry you waited so long for it. We're not going to use it. And so those are things, thankfully, that did not happen with the Rikers piece, but they have happened before. And that's kind of the benefit of having fresh eyes on something. And I think also what makes like the feedback process at times painful because you're delivering news to people who are connected to a project, being like, it's not working, or like, I don't think like what you want to translate is translating. And I think the biggest thing, the last thing I'll say is like, I think the editor's job is to say, okay, you want to get to point, you want to get to C. We have to like use A and B to get there. I also want to get to C. It's probably the same finish line we want to get to, but the way you're getting there is not effective. So let me suggest this other way to get there, but we're going to arrive at the same place with the same takeaways. And I think that is what I have found to be like the best place, the best way to like negotiate differences in an edit is making sure we're working towards the same thing. What is the best way to get there? And usually that just means you find like a better, quicker way to get to the finish line at the end of it.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, 2 more questions. All of the students wanted to know what's your favorite project you've ever worked on and why.
I worked on this piece about Bob Ross, which is funny because I sometimes am like, oh God, the Bob Ross piece again, because it was probably the most successful piece I've worked on. You guys may or may not have seen it by this point, but we like...
Some of the students have seen it, but I'll include a link to it.
Okay. It's like we uncovered where all the Bob Ross paintings are. It was so fun to work on that piece because the characters are hilarious, and like being in an edit room with them for 4 months was not like depressing. It was really funny. And the team of people at the times that I worked on that project with are awesome. So it was a really fun process of getting that piece through the finish line. Like every part of it was hilarious and fun, and like there was no ill will, there were no like conflicting visions. We were on the same page at all times, which was awesome. And then people responded to it so well. I think like I've never worked on a piece that like isn't controversial in some way. Like people will always find a way to make something controversial. Like someone will always be on YouTube being like, you suck. But that piece is like, everyone on YouTube's advocating to get me a raise. It's awesome. I was like, this is the best. So I think that was probably the most fun project. Certainly I've worked on projects that, you know, have more social impact that like are important to me for a very different reason. And that I feel like I became a better person because of those projects. Whereas this project was just like a luxury and fun and quirky and like something the world needed and we didn't even know. So it's complicated, but I guess the Bob Ross project was probably one of the top projects so far.
That's amazing. It's so good. It's so good.
Funny. It definitely feels like, I think many of the projects I work on, like I've covered the elections in Israel or like the Amazon fires in Brazil, like those experiences were like experiences I'll never forget. They like have given me like a window into parts of the world that I would never see, and just a greater understanding and also just like greater empathy for what people around the world are dealing with. That is not what Bob Ross did. But the Bob Ross project, I think, I feel like what reflected like my like humor in a way that like the Amazon fires piece did not reflect my humor. It shouldn't reflect my humor. Neither did like Israel elections. And so it just, the approach to the Bob Ross piece just felt like so much more like an extension of myself. And it was just like fun to honestly explore that, because that's not usually what I do.
All right, last question is, these are a bunch of students. And so what's one of the biggest, just like what's a piece of advice you would give them as they're trying to navigate to figure out what they want to do or to figure out visual journalism, things like that? Just what's like maybe a piece of advice that you'd give them?
Well, are these students, are they seniors or juniors or where are they?
Seniors, but most of them are juniors and seniors.
Cool. So I would say this is the advice I gave. Um, usually my advice is like, be ambitious, go to your goals. Like, you're going to face adversity. Like when I applied, I was like desperate to get to the LA Times in college, which Evie remembers. And I applied for like 30 plus internships. The summer I ended up going there, and all of them said no or just didn't respond. Like I was really bad. And I was desperate for anyone to believe in me. And finally I got this scholarship to intern at the LA Times on top of their summer paid interns. So I got paid through like a scholarship instead. Um, but like my biggest advice would be like, be ambitious. Like you just be like, well, be inventive, like reach out to people, find mentors, be nice, like be humble, always be humble. That doesn't mean like be like a pushover. But realize that like, if you're a student or wherever you are, like wherever you're starting off, be like willing to learn is really what I mean by be humble. Just be like open to like whatever people have to say. People's experiences are valid in the industry. They're greatly varied. But specific to right now, the advice I just recently gave to a class was be ambitious, but be ambitious in your own backyard. Like this is not the time to like do a big move to New York or like do a big move to somewhere for like an uncertain job or to freelance. I think like, before I might say like, yeah, like you can make it here or you can do it there. But I think right now we don't totally know what the country or the economy is going to look like in a year from now. And it only like now more than ever, like use this time to focus on stories in your own backyard where you're not paying for hotels, you're not paying for like every meal on the road, you're not like taking time away from your family or from like your own hospital or wherever you're at. Just try to like get to know your community more because there's so many stories that need to be told. I would kill to be in Macon, Georgia right now and not in New York City because like everyone's trying to tell the stories of New York City right now, largely because we can't leave. And this place is so big, it's so saturated, and like desperately I would love to be somewhere like rural or at least with like a community that knows itself. Like I don't know my neighbors here. I would love to be telling like a pandemic story or something related to the pandemic, which everything is, through like a local lens. And so I would say right now, like this is the time to dig in, know your neighbors, be safe. Nothing is worth it. Nothing. No visual story is worth the risk to your health, if you're at risk or what have you. But be smart in terms of money. Always be smart in terms of money. Don't take huge risks right now, but like dig into your own backyard would be, I guess, my advice for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was so helpful.
And to be clear, you should always dig into your own backyard. It's not just because you can't leave it that you like should be digging in right now. But I think like if your impulse, I know my impulse was to leave my tiny town in North Carolina. I was like, I'm getting out of there, and to come to New York. Not everyone is like that. But it definitely makes me think, God, if I would have stayed, or like there always are stories in those towns. There's always stories in your own community, but like use this time right now where you like shouldn't leave or you can't leave, to really dig in and like not be distracted by like, oh, what's happening here, what's happening there. Like just focus on your own place.
I think it's actually been really like an interesting thing that's come out of this outbreak has been that so many journalists are stuck in these random places that they're from. And so we are seeing more stories, I think, from, usually stories are like New York, DC, LA, maybe really big
Yeah,
cities. And we're seeing those. We're seeing it out of Chicago, but we're also seeing so many people cover their own places who are
yeah,
who they are, which I think has been really neat.
totally.
All right. Thank you, Emily.